in Oklahoma City. Miss Cohee, where were you born?
I was born in Chicago, but the folks moved out to the country when I was a year old to McHenry County.
And when's your birthday?
April 11th, 1893.
1893. Who was your father?
August J. Albright.
A-L...
Brecht.
And your mother?
Mother was Emma. Emma, S-C-H-M-I-D-T.
Schmidt.
Pronounced Smith.
Yeah. Now, you say your father came from Germany?
Yes, when he was 15.
Mm-hmm. Did he talk about why he came to this country?
Yes, he did. He used to talk to us children a lot about Germany. They were super poor, and there was a large family, and the children had to get out and work. Their father was a lamplighter, and the wages were small. People just didn't own land there. There were some land barons, but they did not own farms like they do here. And they were super poor, and the children all worked. They'd herd sheep or they'd do different things. And so he had an aunt and uncle that had came over before, a few years before, and that aunt and uncle sent for 3 of the children. One of his brothers and one of his sisters, and the 3 of them, the other 2.
A redbud tree leaf is heart-shaped?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I never had that.
We used to have them in the yard.
I planted a redbud tree, and I know of 2 redbuds in the state that are white instead of red.
Well,
They're a mutation of some kind, but they have a white blossom.
You were talking about Germany.
mm-hmm.
About why your father came to this country.
Yes, because there really wasn't any chance for people that were as poor as they were. And so the aunt and uncle that were living in Illinois, they sent for those 3 children and paid their way and brought them over.
Did he talk about the trip on the boat?
It was pretty bad. I don't know, there's a lot of detail, but the boat was very crowded. And when they got to Ellis Island, he said it was horrible. There were no accommodations, and it was just, it was pretty bad at Ellis Island, and they had to stay there in quarantine for a while before they would let them go on where they were going.
And were they going to Illinois at that time?
Yes, my aunt and uncle were situated. They had a small farm in Illinois, and not very far from where Dad finally settled. And they were established. They'd been there several years and were established, and they were a big help to them to get jobs for them. They went to work on the farms nearby, and my dad never got any more education after he was 15. But in Germany, they bore down on education. That was one thing they did. And they had school almost 13 months out of the year. They had 1 week off for Easter and 1 week for Christmas. The rest of the time they were in school. And my father was so well read, he was an avid reader, and by the time he was grown up, he was almost equal. I think he could have passed for college entrance at 15 because he was so well schooled in the lower grades, you know. And so, of course, he was a farmer all his life, so.
Did he speak English when he came to this country? Your father?
No, they had to learn that, all three of them. They all had to learn to speak English because where they lived, there was no chance, and they didn't teach it at schools, you know. They just spoke what they call High German, and that is the printed word, High German.
What about your mother? Did she come from Germany also?
No, mother was American born, but her parents were German. They came from Germany. But mother was born in Crystal Lake, Illinois, and she was American born.
What part of Germany did your parents come from? Your father?
It is now behind the wall. And my father, before he passed away, he felt so bad about that. And he was financially able to go back to Germany and visit. And we told him that we would go with him. And he says, I don't want to go because my old home is behind the wall. So it was Wittenberg and Lansing. He was born at Lansing, and then mostly they lived at Wittenberg.
And when did your parents get married?
1889.
1889.
And that was the year Oklahoma opened on free land. And Dad wanted to come and get some free land. And there was so much bad publicity about Oklahoma, those Indians and those wild train robbers and all that. And Mother wouldn't come. So he never completely got Oklahoma out of his system. And a number of years later, of course, it got kind of civilized, and so they came to Oklahoma.
Would you tell me the chores that you did on the farm in Illinois as a small girl?
The chores that we did?
Yes.
Well, 11-year-old don't do too many, but we had to do whatever came along that we were physically able to do. Of course, we were in school. The hardest thing that I had when I was growing up that I remember is walking 1.5 miles to school when there was so much snow on the ground and it was frozen so hard that we could walk, cut across the fields on top of the snow. It must have been 4 or 5 feet deep, and it was frozen so hard we could walk on top of it. Over people's fences, you know. It was deeper than people's fences were tall. And that was a real hardship. And the clothing that we had to wear to keep from freezing. I remember we had a brown wool veil, and Mother would tie that over our faces, so keep our faces from freezing. And we had wool hoods, we had wool stockings, we had wool leggings, we had Arctic overshoes, name it.
And what part of Illinois was this located? What part of Illinois was this located where you lived?
It was in McHenry County, about 60 miles northeast of Chicago, and it was cold.
Why did the family move to Oklahoma?
Well, because land had got so high in Illinois, and we were on a rented farm. Dad was in the dairy business. They had 36 cows that they had to milk by hand. There was no machines made. And it was cold. My dad always wore a mustache, and he had icicles hanging out of his mustache. It was so cold you wouldn't believe it unless you'd been through it. And so he had some brothers, and 2 of them had passed away with what they called consumption, which they called TB at this time. And my father developed a cough, and that really frightened Mother. And so she decided it was time to change front.
And tell me the items that you packed to bring to Oklahoma.
The what?
The items that you packed to bring to Oklahoma.
We brought all the household furniture that we had, and Dad and Mother had a sale, sold all the dairy cows at a high auction sale, and sold their horses, everything like that. We had one horse. It was a family pet. And it was a great big old heavy black horse, and her name was Dolly. And she had broken her foot, and nobody would bid on her. And so Dad loaded her in the freight car too, along with the chickens and the other household things. And we landed in Norman, Oklahoma. And the reason that they picked on Norman, there was a couple in Norman that had a saloon. Their names was Lawrence. And they were in the saloon business. But my dad had known them in this little town of Union. My dad knew this couple, and they came to Oklahoma to put on their saloon. And Dad knew that couple, and he wanted to come to Norman because he felt that they could help him locate what was good land, what was bad land, and what the country was like. He came by himself in August. They came to Oklahoma to look it over and talk to this couple in Norman. And they got such a good report from those people, and took some drives with the real estate people around in the country. And they were both very impressed, so the two families came together to Norman, and Dad rented a house, and we lived there for 2 months before he found a farm. And he didn't have a lot of money. He only had, I think, about $1,600 when he came here. And he didn't have enough to pay for a farm, and he didn't want to go in debt because he didn't know what the country would deliver, and he'd lose what little he did have. And so he found out about the school sections, school land, and he had that explained to him, and so he had money enough. And this man wanted to go to big pasture that was on this school land, and he had his buildings and equipment and everything for sale. And Dad he could afford to buy that and pay for it, and lease the land from the State Department, school land. And so that's where we first lived for about 8 years.
What year did they come? What year did they come to Oklahoma?
1904. In December 1904. And that was the most beautiful weather on Christmas. We had left snow so deep you couldn't see over it. And it was so cold when we left there. And even the train, Mother and us kids came on, it was cold in there. The train wasn't even warm. And on Christmas Day, our first Christmas Day in Oklahoma, it was the most beautiful day. It was the sunshine made to order, and all the children were playing out on the porch with their dolls and the new things they'd received for Christmas there in town. And we wrote back to our friends up there up north and told them all about how nice that was. And then when Dad found this school quarter, and the day we moved out there, it was in January, and it had turned real cold that day. And we had regular winter then, like all our winters. It wasn't so severe, but it got colder. But we were so impressed with it, we thought we'd found paradise.
What toys did you receive for Christmas that year?
Well, we received some games. We were too old for dolls. We received some games. Flinch was quite popular that time. And I remember we were playing Flinch.
That's a card game.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a card game.
It's interesting to know, and a lot of those people, even though they might have committed either a major or minor crime other places and came to Oklahoma, they made pretty solid citizens after they got here.
Like if he was once an outlaw, then turn around years later and run for governor. We had that happen.
Did we?
Al Jennings, don't you remember?
No,
Can you
ma'am.
remember Al Jennings?
I don't remember that.
Oh yes, he was with a group of outlaws a while, and later he reformed, and then he had the nerve to run for governor. He got beat, of course.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I remember that.
Did you attend school in Oklahoma?
Yes, little country school, Robinson District. It's right south of Draper Lake. And it, of course, took a lot of farms around there, Draper Lake. But they're still having school there. But the original building burned, and they had to build a new one. But it's just a one-room school.
Tell me about a one-room school. How does one teacher handle all the different grades?
It is surprising what they can do. We had one teacher, now he was from Tennessee, he was a real gentleman. He would go behind the stove so the girls couldn't see him comb his hair. But he was the nicest guy, he was a good Christian guy, and he was Sunday school superintendent in the schoolhouse and all that. And he handled it, but we were always late finishing. But he stayed with it. He was one of the best teachers that I remember. And the others, some of the others, if they didn't get through with all 8 grades, why, they'd take them the next day. And now, when teachers have so many pupils, when they only have to teach 1 grade, they think they're terribly abused. They can't handle that. But all through grade school, we had 1 teacher for all 8 grades. Maybe there'd just be 3 or 4 students in a certain grade. I know my favorite was arithmetic, and there was only 4 of us in that class. But even so, they had to go through with it and teach it.
What do you do for recreation at school?
What is it?
Recreation.
Oh, the boys got out and played baseball, and we didn't have any recreation. There wasn't anything fixed for us and entertain us and all that. We got in when we got in the schoolroom. We settled down and studied, and or wrote something on the blackboard, our lesson, whatever came up. And the boys during recess or during the noon hour, they would get out there and play ball. But there was no recreation plan. That was unheard of.
Did the girls play games?
No. They just sat around and waited for school to take up. We all had to carry our lunches. There were no cafeterias, of course, and there were no lunchrooms.
What did you take for lunch?
Sandwiches. We had, everybody had their own beef and their own pork. They did their own butchering. They would grow stock to butcher and have the best veal in the world when those newborn calves got a little older. And we had our own chickens, and there was always plenty to eat. We had a garden that wouldn't quit. Food was no problem. Everybody had food, whether they had an extra dollar or not, they did have food.
What were your chores on the farm in Oklahoma when you moved down here?
What were our chores?
Yes, ma'am.
Milking, picking cotton, helping with the canning, like peeling peaches and doing whatever it takes to do that. Wash dishes. I stood on a box and washed dishes ever since I was big enough to reach the dishpan. And I got to where I hated the sight of a dirty dish.
How'd you do laundry?
On the board. And we always had to have a hired man in when we lived on the dairy farm. And Mother had to do the hard hands washing in those old heavy jeans. I don't know how the poor thing did it. She used to put those jeans on a rubbing board, and then she'd take an old scrub brush and she'd scrub them. That was really doing things the hard way.
The fabric was coarse and heavy.
Yes, it was coarse and heavy jeans. You know, they weren't those fancy jeans you see nowadays. It just, overalls is what they were.
Did you use homemade soap or store-bought soap?
My mother made soap one time, and she decided it was too much and the soap was too strong. But an awful lot of people were making their own soap.
Have you ever made soap?
Hmm?
Did you make soap?
No, I never learned to make soap. But the grown-ups, older women, they always made their own soap when we first came.
Was there ever a woman in the neighborhood who made exceptionally good soap, and the other neighbors would trade her things for soap?
Mm-mm. I don't remember anything about that. I think they all had the same formula.
Well, some...
That old Lewis lye, you know.
Oh. And that's what they made it with.
Uh-huh.
That was that the pure old lye soap.
And then their grease.
And it was made with cracklings or the lard that was rendered from the meat.
Grease, uh-huh.
Were you a good cotton picker?
I was the best picker in the family. One day we had a big patch of cotton, and it was so white and pretty. I picked 202 pounds, and I was the only one in the family that got up to 200. But real good cotton pickers were picking 3 and more. You know, big strong boy, he could pick 300 pounds.
How big was your cotton sack?
I was trying to think this morning, and I thought, well, was it 9 feet long? And I know they weren't 9 feet long, but they must have been 6. And we put them around our shoulder and drag them behind us. And then when they got too heavy to drag, well, we'd go to the scales at the wagon. The wagon was parked over there, and go and weigh and keep track of it.
Did you pull bowls?
No, there was no bowl pulling, and not only that, the buyers were so particular, they didn't even want any leaves and trash in theirs. Some of them didn't get as much for their cotton as those that were very careful with it. If you didn't put in a lot of leaves and sticks and things, you got more for your cotton. And so if you was a clean cotton picker, why, you know, it was better. And they didn't start pulling bowls till years later.
Were there different sizes of cotton sacks? When little youngsters would start to pick cotton, I have seen them with short sacks for the little guys to pick in.
Well,
and then if a person could pick as much as 300 pounds, they'd have these big long 6 and 7 foot long sacks.
Well, we had just that one length, and I know they were 6 feet.
Did the owner, if you had hired hands to pick, who furnished their cotton sack?
They brought their own.
What was the sack made of?
Heavy canvas. Just real thick, heavy canvas. And every family made their own. The women sewed them up.
Did you help butcher?
No, I didn't have to help with that. But we did have to help after the actual butchering was over. We had to help grind the sausage, which had to be done by hand. Grind up, you know, for sausage and hamburgers and whatever.
How did you preserve your sausage?
Huh?
How did you preserve your sausage?
Smoked it. Uh-huh.
I've heard some people fry the sausage down and poured hot grease over it.
Yes, we did some of that. Occasionally Mother did that, but we had a pretty big smokehouse and smoked hams and bacon and all that.
Well, did you put it in casings to smoke it?
Well, there was a certain kind, yes, it had to be in cases.
Muslin or gut or what?
No, it was well, what do we call it? Hog casings.
Casing.
Yeah.
Intestines.
Uh-huh. Yeah, hog casings.
That was a chore to...
It was a terrible job to clean.
to put it in the casings, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And we had a sausage machine that we put the casing on that little sausage machine, had a handle to bear down on it, and it would fill up.
Oh,
May I turn this light on?
Huh?
May I turn this light on?
Sure.
Yeah.
well, I couldn't imagine anyone of German extraction not being able to make good sausage.
Oh, I know. We did have good sausage.
How did you celebrate the 4th of July?
Well, we always had a picnic in Norman at the park on 4th of July. And they would have those great big dairy tanks. They were huge, great big around and pretty deep. They would get new ones from the mill. And they would make lemonade in there. And they had a quip they would holler out, lemonade made in the shade, good enough for any old maid.
Did you go to dances?
What?
Did you go to dances? Did you have dances in the area?
Oh, yes, but we weren't allowed to go to them. I'll tell you, there was a bunch of boys that was always around on horseback, because that was the way most of them went, on horseback. And if they hadn't been invited to that dance, they'd go out by and they'd shoot the lights out. Well, Mother would never let us go to a dance. We just weren't allowed to go to them. And then the girls that were in church and Sunday school, they would get together. We could go to a play party, but they didn't have music at a play party, but they would sing. They would go around in circles and they would sing little quippy songs, you know, instead of music, and that seemed to make it all right religiously. But if you had music, why, that was a dance.
What songs did you sing?
It'll take me a week to catch up on that. I used to be able to, I know something about Sue and Skip to Maloo, my darling, and I couldn't get that song together. It's the first time I thought of it in years.
Lulu, skip to Maloo, skip to Maloo, my darling.
Skip to Maloo, my darling. We'd sing that around in a circle and sort of dance like, but we wouldn't have any music at a dance. And you know that the people there, most of them, their homes were so small, and they would take their beds. Now this sounds unreal. They would take out all the furniture in one room. If there was less in one of the bedrooms than there was in the rest of the house, they would take one of the bedrooms and they would move the beds and the furniture out in the yard, and they'd have a dance.
Who furnished the music?
Oh, there were a lot of country fiddlers those days. The neighbors. There was always somebody in the neighborhood that could fiddle.
Oh, when they sang those songs, like Lulu, Skip to Maloo, did they do kind of a dance to them?
Yes, it was kind of a dance step, but they didn't have music, so it wasn't a dance, it was a play party.
Okay. There are ways to do things, aren't there, and still remain respectable.
My husband's mother, when things like that happened, she'd say, "That's just a way of running the devil around the stuff."
Did I have heard people talk about stove wood they use in the kitchen,
Yeah,
and then wash wood?
yeah.
Is there a difference in stove wood
Yes,
and wash wood?
because most of the people had a great big old black iron kettle, and they would have that hot out in the yard with their wash wood. It was wood that wasn't chopped as stove length. It was bigger pieces. It was heavier pieces, And they would build that under their big old wash kettle, and they'd heat their water in that big old black kettle. Everyone had one of those. And that was the difference between the stove wood and the wash wood.
Okay, so the stove wood is chopped to a certain length.
It was chopped to fit your stove.
Okay. What was the best wood to burn in the stove?
Blackjack.
That's oak, isn't it?
Did you
Yeah.
chop wood?
We were right among the blackjacks, you know.
Did you chop wood?
No. My dad always took care of the wood chopping. Us girls didn't. I had a brother, and he chopped wood, but us girls didn't have to. I had an older sister, and we didn't have to chop any wood. We had a good old daddy that did those things.
Could you describe what Norman looked like when you first moved there in 1904?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that really surprised us. My dad had gone downtown. We were about 2 blocks from Middletown. And my dad had gone down there to talk to a real estate man and see where he could find a farm. And he came back pretty quick, and he said, "Come on, kids," said, I'm going to take you out to the street. He said, "There's a fella just now drove in with his team of oxen." And he had a team of oxen on a great big old wagon, and he was parked there on the street, and one of the oxen was lying down, and they had drove in from east of us, several miles east, which is around Stella someplace, and we called it the Sand Hills. Our dad's place, where we lived, our farm, was on Elm Creek, and it was bottom land, see. And if you were away from the bottom land, why, you were in the Sand Hills. And he had driven from the Sand Hills with that team of oxen to Norman to get some supplies, whatever it was he needed. And that was quite shocking, you know, for us, because that's the first of that he'd ever seen.
You've been used to horses.
Could you tell me, what else do you remember about Norman downtown?
Well, the university had one building, and that one building is still standing. And there was just one building that it consisted of, the university. And of course, there weren't very many people there because transportation, you had to go horseback if you was out in the country. And Norman was a small town, and it had that one saloon. So there just wasn't really much to it. We'd walk around, and we were just west of we lived just west of the mental sanatorium. We were about 3 blocks from there. On that same street, we lived west of it.
Do you remember the name of the man who had the first saloon?
Yes, he was a friend of my dad's. That's what brought us to Norman, Oklahoma. His name was Lawrence.
Lawrence.
He and his son, and his son's wife, and his wife. The really 2 families, but it was father and son, see. And they had a saloon at Norman. And that's, Dad had known them in our hometown. And that's how come he landed in Norman, through that couple.
What was the location? Where was the location of the saloon?
It was on Main Street. Just on Main Street. That's all there was to Norman then, just Main Street.
You ever go inside the saloon?
And there was a horse and mule barn not very far from there. And he sold horses. He raised horses and sold them to the government during later, let me see what purpose. I've forgotten why he was selling those to the government. It wasn't wartime, you know. But anyway...
they still had cavalry. They still had some cavalry units.
Well,
but during World War I, the government bought huge amounts of mules and horses.
Yeah, Well, anyway, it was a horse and mule barn. I remember it because we had to pass it. Just a little above a village. I don't think it even had a restaurant or a cafeteria. It did have a hotel, but it wasn't much of a hotel. Best I remember, it was right by the railroad track. Some of the salesmen would come in, and traveling salesmen would come.
And a merchandise store.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember the merchandise store?
Yes, I remember Ruckers. And some of the
Ruckers.
Ruckers are still in that part of the world down here in that county, the Rucker family. It was a Rucker's dry goods store, and calico was 10 yards for a quarter. Can you believe that?
10 yards for a quarter.
And Mother sent us to the store to go pick out some material because she didn't have anything to do. She knew when they got moved she'd be busy. And she made our school dresses.
Did you ever get to go inside that saloon?
No. Women didn't go in saloons. Girls either. Boys either. They weren't allowed. They had to get out of there real quick. No, they had stricter laws then. And if anybody ever gave an Indian liquor, they were in real trouble. Because when the Indian got drunk, they were pretty vicious. And it was so against the law, every once in a while an Indian would cross over from Indian territory and come to Norman. And they were all scared to death. They wouldn't have sold a pint of liquor to an Indian.
How far away was Indian territory?
It was across the Red River. Across the Red River is all.
Which?
Across the Canadian River. Canadian River. And they forded that, and I'll tell you, it had so much quicksand. The winter that we were living in Norman, a man lost his thrashing outfit. It went down the quicksand, and he almost lost his life. And every once in a while, somebody would lose their horse. That quicksand, I don't know what happened to it. It isn't there. You don't hear about it. But there were no bridges, and there was no way of getting to Indian Territory, only fording the river, the Canadian.
See, now, was the Indian Territory on the south side of the Canadian?
South. It was on the south side of, south of us,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
south of Oklahoma
And this
Territory.
was considered Oklahoma Territory.
That was the Chickasaw Nation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell me about floods on the Canadian.
Huh?
Tell me about the floods on the Canadian.
Well, we used to have a lot of those. That's the reason they had such a hard time keeping a bridge. I guess they didn't have the skill to really know how to build a good bridge, and the bridges would wash out. The floods would take those bridges right out. They had a lot of that, of having to rebuild bridges. And then they had a toll bridge. One of the bridges that was a better bridge, it was a toll bridge, and that bridge stayed up for years and years and years after I was grown. And it was a toll. And they had to pay toll on that till Governor Murray came along and he stopped that stuff. He took the toll off the bridge.
Did you know many of the people that were in the university?
Well, we knew one family, and they had a big 2-story house, and they were keeping students. They were renting rooms out to students.
What was in there?
And because there was no hotel, there were no housing for students, and the students had to find their own rooms. And there were a number of people. Some of those old 2-story houses are still standing on University Row, and people would, buy those homes and then rent them to students.
Ever go to the football games?
I don't remember a single football game those years. I don't think they played football, because I would remember that, I'm sure. But I sure don't remember them ever having a football game. It was such a small place with just one building there. That building is still standing. It's the one that has that kind of a peak or steeple of a thing or something
Yeah, I
on
think
it.
that's the old administration building.
Uh-huh.
Did you know Dr. Boyd?
I didn't meet him personally, but I remember him. I remember Dr. Boyd because he was there a long, long time.
What was the name of the people that was renting rooms to students.
Dunsing, the particular people that we knew, their name was Dunsing.
Dunsing.
Also German.
Yes. Well, the reason I was asking, this Mr. Ezel lives across the street, was raised in one of those big two-story houses down there.
Well.
And that was, thought maybe it might, coincidence might be the same family.
Tell me about Statehood Day.
Statehood Day, we were out in the field picking cotton, and we heard the siren blow from Oklahoma City, which was 18 miles away. And Dad said, well, kids, that's no longer Indian Territory. We're in the state of Oklahoma now. And that was it, and we went right on picking cotton. We didn't have any playtime.
Was there a big celebration in Norman, or?
Oh, I'll tell you what happened. It was exciting, only we didn't get to see it. All saloons, you know, that was the beginning. Statehood was the beginning of 21 years of prohibition for Oklahoma, the day it became a state. And the saloon keepers, they had been warned, liquor will have to go, so that they wouldn't have a big order of liquor on hand. That day, they said Oklahoma City streets were almost flooded with people having to pour out their beer and all their alcoholic liquors and all that. And some of those old drinkers, those people, said they were out there with cups trying to catch some of it. They hated to see it go down the sewer.
What a waste.
That was really something to write home about, was then saloon keepers having to empty all their liquor that very day and go out of business. And then we, of course, had dry for 21 years, so-called dry for 21 years. That's when the Jake Leg people and all those developed.
Where does the term Jake Leg come from?
From the liquor they drank that they made in home brew, and for some reason or other, the combination they used caused a poison in the drink, and they had been warned by the health department to not drink homemade brew and stuff like that. And they were so desperate they'd drink anything that was liquid. And there's a certain amount of alcoholics that drank it, and that developed Jake Leg. It developed what they call Jake Leg was from that brew they drank.
What does Jake Leg do to the person?
Oh, it crippled them. It crippled them. They had to walk on a cane. It crippled their legs. And they had to walk on a cane.
And where does the term bootlegger come from?
Well, I don't know where that name bootlegger came from, but we had one behind every bush, I think, at that time. Later.
I heard that the term originated that they would carry the whiskey in a boot.
Exactly.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. That sounds logical.
You know how the bootleggers delivered their whiskey in Norman?
Did we what?
Do you know how the bootleggers delivered their whiskey in Norman?
No, we just, we weren't in with a bunch like that, and I just don't know about any details, but Norman was real strict because it was a university town. Norman was stricter than Oklahoma City about their liquor. And one horrible thing that shocked us, now we weren't used to black people. There was one black farmer that lived just, in the next farm from us, and he was alone, and we didn't pay much attention to him, and he didn't bother nobody, and he was just a black man, and he just lived there. That was all that we knew about black people. But anyway, we weren't prejudiced because we hadn't been into that. And when we got to Norman, there was a huge sign. Now what I mean, it was huge. Said, "Nigger, don't let the sun go down on you tonight."
Yeah, that was in 1904.
No, it was after. It was when we came. We came here in December 1903, and that was in 4 and 5, and And 6, it took several years to get that sign down. And nobody would go, none of the black people would go near Norman. I don't know, that sign was up there a long time. It was a huge sign. And we thought, my goodness, said, isn't that awful? It looked scary to us. You know, that big sign. And it was on the edge of the main road that went in there. Huge sign. And it said nigger. There's no black man. It was not Negro. It was nothing. It was plain nigger.
Did anyone ever know who erected that sign?
The city of Norman did. The city of Norman did that. They took that on themselves. But no one pursued it. No one evidently didn't do anything about it. Or, you know, it would be illegal. But I don't know. They got by with it for a long time. I've often wondered why they did since I got older.
Were there many blacks living around Norman?
Hmm?
Were there many blacks living around Norman?
No, most of them were what we called the sand hills. They were very poor, and they couldn't afford good bottom land, and there weren't very many of them close to Norman, and of course there weren't none in. And even after that sign went down, you know, blacks would not live in Norman, and they wouldn't go to Norman if they could get around it.
I was going to ask about ironing the clothes after you did the washing.
We had three irons, old sad irons. We'd set them on the stove to heat them. They had a handle, and that handle would fit all 3 of the irons. And we had to, of course, everything had to be ironed those days, cotton stuff. And we had to sprinkle them down, and then heat the sad irons on the stove, and iron with one of them until it got cold, till it got too cold to get the wrinkles out. Then we'd have to go change them. It was a real chore. Then go get a hot iron and
disengage your handle and put it on the hot iron and go back to work.
Change handles.
How much of a shirt or a dress could you iron before you had to change irons?
Oh, I can't tell you that. Maybe 2.
What about starch?
Oh yeah, they had to be starched.
What did you use? Did you make your own starch?
We made our own starch.
How do you make it?
Well, take a tablespoon of starch and dissolve it in some cold water and have some boiling water on the stove and pour that boiling water over that tablespoon of starch and keep stirring it and it gets real thick and jelly-like. And then it's too thick to dip your shirt in or blouse, whatever. And then you'd put some cold water in it to thin it down a little and go ahead and starch.
So you use a store-bought starch to mix it up?
Yeah.
Did you ever make it with flour?
No.
Did you know how to make it with flour?
No, never heard of it until now.
What year did you graduate from high school?
I did not go to high school. We were 10 miles from high school. We didn't have cars. It would have been horseback. I started to ride a mule one time. We had an old tame old mule, and I rode him around on the farm for about a half a day, and it took me 2-3 days to catch up. I couldn't walk, and I didn't know it'd do that to me, and I never got on a horse again after that. And we did not go to high school. We finished our 8th grade, and Norman was the closest place where there was a high school, and of course Dad couldn't afford to board us out, and no transportation, just horseback, and you couldn't have made that in rain and snow and whatever else come along, wind, and so we just didn't go to high school. I got married when I was 17. There wasn't anything else to do. But I was married for 64 years to the same man.
Where did you meet your husband?
At school, grade school.
And what's his name?
Cohee.
What's his first name?
John Cleveland.
John Cleveland Cohee.
Mm-hmm.
And when were you married?
We was married in the Norman courthouse.
What year?
1910. December 1910.
What day in December?
17th.
You have a honeymoon?
No. Had never, I don't think the word had been coined, had it? No, nobody had any honeymoons.
So what'd you do on your wedding day? What'd you do on your wedding day?
Well, after we got married, we went home and had lunch and came to Oklahoma City. His mother and dad had moved to Oklahoma City. And we came to Oklahoma City, and my husband had bought a little 2-room house. We had 2 rooms and a bath. And he had $1,000 that he had made while he was working with his dad on the farm, and he paid cash for that. And then he got a job, and we started living like normal people.
Where'd you live in Oklahoma City?
On the corner of C Street and Walnut. And C Street is now Southeast 25.
So you moved to what is now Southeast Oklahoma City?
Mm-hmm. Southeast 25th. And it's on the corner of 25th and Walnut.
What kind of work did your husband do?
Well, different things. We were in the printing business for 12 years, but before that he worked at a broom factory where they made brooms out on West Main Street, Killinger Broom Company, and he worked there for 14 years. And then the penitentiary at McAllister was still letting individual people come in there and manufacture or work or have work for the convicts. And so his firm moved to McAllister, and they took him with him, and he worked in McAllister a while at the penitentiary, teaching the convicts there, working with the convicts. But he got so tired of that he had to be away from home, and so he quit that and came home. Our oldest son was starting to school. He said his daddy was in the penitentiary. He told the kindergarten teacher. So we had to straighten that out.
It was time to change jobs.
And then he had to change jobs, and he was out of work for a little while, but if there was a job around, he had it. And he worked for the American Express Company a while, and then finally we went in the printing business, and we was in the printing business for 12 years. And then when the war started, World War II, our son had to go to service. He had to go to war. And we couldn't get material that we needed in the printing business, and so we stored our printing equipment, and he went out to Tinkerfield and worked out there. So in the meantime, then we thought we'd go back in business after the war, which we didn't. We sold the equipment, and he went out to Tinkerfield.
Where was your printing business?
It was in the 200 block on West Reno. Downtown.
Did you own that building? Did they displace you during urban renewal?
Yes. Yeah, my dad owned the building, and he had built it. And when urban renewal came along, in the meantime, my parents had died, and Dad had left the building to me. And urban renewal came along, and they were going to wreck it. And that was so unfair, that urban renewal, and they ruined the downtown. Never will be a downtown again. But anyway, I tried to protest, but it didn't seem to help. But the worst of it was that not only was I forced to sell the building, but I had to pay income tax on it, which I thought was very unfair. didn't want to sell it in the first place and then have to pay income tax on the building.
Was that early on?
And my dad had already paid a gift tax on it when he gave me the building. Mother had died and Dad was living with us. And he had paid a gift tax. They've done away with the gift tax now. But Dad had to pay a gift tax when he gave me the building. And then when I was forced to sell it, I had to pay income tax on it. Now that's double dipping.
Was that one of the first buildings that were demolished?
Yes, it was the first building that was wrecked, and it stood there with big high weeds. As a vacant lot, it stood there until they began to wreck all the rest of them downtown, which was almost 10 years that they could have left that building. Cornish Furniture Company was in it and had been in it, and I was getting good rent for it. And then it was in the same block where Fred Jones had his Fords. He was on the corner and we were in the middle of the block. And he wound up with those 3 lots that building was on. An individual guy, he wound up with that, and it had stood there on vacant lots all that time. That was as unfair as the deal between the North and South in the Civil War.
Well, the Mr. Cohee, where did he originate? Your husband?
Oh, my husband, he was born in White Bead, Indian Territory. And he was born in he was 4 years older than I, and he was born in, he was in 89, he was born in 89, but his dad didn't make the run. They were living in near Pauls Valley, but that's where he first came from.
Where had they migrated from?
Arkansas. That's where the Civil War made them poor folks. That's why we're still poor folks. What the Yankees did to the Southern people.
I mean, taking their land and their animals and
Taking their crops. They took their crops for food. They took their horses that they used, and they even took an old white mule that belonged to his father's family, and everything that was loose, and it left them without anything. And his mother, her people, had just sold their farm. Texas seemed to be on a boom, and land was cheap, and you could buy so much more land than what the price of your farm in Arkansas would buy. And so they sold their farm on White River. It was just a wonderful farm. There's no better land than White River, you know. And they got Confederate money for it. They had a trunk full, I think. And then they knew that the South was going to win the war. But the North won the war. And that Confederate money wasn't redeemed at no price, not 1%. And nothing was restored to them. And his father, my husband's father, he said that the first garden they had to practically dig it by hand because they didn't have a plow, they didn't have anything to pull the plow, the machinery was there. And finally, that old white government mule came back. Some way or other, they hadn't used him or they'd turned him loose. But he had the U.S. brand on him. They had branded him. But the old mule came back, and they had that one old white mule to start farming with. And his mother's people, they didn't have anything but a handful of Confederate money and got nothing for it. And my mother-in-law was so bitter. She had to work for 50 cents a week for some people. She was 18 years old, and she had to work. That was after the war. She was born during the Civil War. And she had to work for that and do weaving and everything else.
For an entire family?
For the whole family, yes. she was very bitter, and I didn't blame her. And then our northern cousins, I told them the story about what happened to the family at the Civil War. He shut it off. And she said, well, you're a rebel. I said, no, I'm not a rebel. I said, that's just common sense. I said, after we whipped Germany, we went ahead and sent them some money.
Lots of it.
And I said, here it was the United States, and they didn't do nothing. The only thing his dad said that they ever got from the government was some hardtack, and he said he wasn't fit to eat.
Well, I've heard hardtack. What is hardtack?
It's a biscuit that's made with flour and water.
And
There's one.
the
Isn't
government.
there a hardtack biscuit at the in the historical?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. I thought I remember
And the
seeing
government
it.
issued hardtack to people.
They were issued hardtack, and it wasn't fit to eat. They couldn't eat it. But anyway, that's all the government did for them after the war.
Well, I guess that attests to the pioneer spirit of some of the people that built Oklahoma. The fact that they came out here and did make it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was what pushed them out here, some of them.
Yes.
Was your grandfather on your mother's side in the Civil War?
No. See, he was in Germany.
He was in Germany.
He was in Germany during the early years.
What did you do during World War I?
Well, we had a little 5-year-old, and I put in a lot of time worrying whether his daddy was going to have to go to war. And I had never worked. We were living on the east side. I had never worked. I didn't know what I was going to do, but it so happened that the war was over. He would have been in the next draft. He had to register. But really, we just couldn't do anything special. There was so much of the food that was rationed. It was hard to get shortening, and it was hard to get sugar, and there was a lot of things that there was really a scarcity of that they needed for the soldiers.
Did you wrap bandages or knit for the soldiers?
Yes, I did. We had regular meetings with the helping the Red Cross with rolling bandages and things like that. And we also all gave blood transfusions. We gave blood for that. And all the women, if they were young enough, we helped in every way we knew how to help. We were really a busy bunch of people.
Is that organized through your church?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, through the church and neighborhoods, different neighborhoods,
What church did you attend in Oklahoma City when you first moved here?
Presbyterian. We were just a block from a church that I'm still in. It was a Presbyterian, and it was on the corner of Old C Street and Central Avenue. And I'm still in that same church, only we're in a different building, and we're up here on Southwestern now. But the people changed.
How big was the original building?
The organizing was in a tent in 1909. They organized in a tent, and the downtown Central Presbyterian Church was our mother church. They were the organizers and the star, of our church. And then they built the basement, and it was a basement when we first moved there on the corner. It was a basement, and we lived just a block from it. And then years later, they put the top on.
Did you buy the land, or was the land donated by a member?
No, they bought the land. They bought the land, just some lots, a couple of lots. And it was right on the corner. And the building is still there. They're having some sort of a denomination. They're having church there, but it's not a Presbyterian church.
Who were the charter members of the church? How many?
I believe there were 30. See, that was before we were connected with it. It was 1909, late 1909 when it was organized. And we didn't, it was 1911 when we started it there.
Were you influenced? Did the oil boom influence you? That I know that it was located in that southeastern part of Oklahoma City. How did the oil boom affect you in Oklahoma City?
Well, of course, we had some rental property, and we did get a little more money for the rentals because living parts were scarce. They were leased. We had 4 lots there on the corner at that time, and we Phillips Oil Company, they came around and they leased everybody's lots over there, and they had a derrick in the block south of us. They had a derrick and was pumping in the block north of us, and we were in the middle of those two. But anyway, they were putting a well on every block, you know, at that time. And so they put a derrick up, we leased, and everybody in the block. And they put the derrick up, and all of a sudden, the government passes a law, only one well to every 40 acres. They come and took our derrick down, and the well south of us and the well north of us kept pumping our oil out from under. That's how we got rich on oil.
That was done.
Yeah, that was done. And now they are leasing again. I don't know why. But you know, I had a letter here where they were wanting to lease this.
Yes.
Over here. And I did lease over on the east side at where I still have the rental. I did lease that, but I don't know when their headquarters are at Edmond. I don't know.
Did you watch the Mary Sudik oil well when it was blowing?
Yes. Oh, that was horrible.
Tell me about that.
Oh, you could read a newspaper out in your backyard where we lived. That was terrible. It got on fire, and it was an awful fire. Oh, I'll tell you, it was terrible.
The light from that fire was so bright you could read a paper.
In your yard. Maybe.
And
You
that
had to
was
have
some
good
miles
eyesight,
away.
of course, but really and truly, it was so close, you know, when we were on the east side, and it was pretty close. We weren't in any danger of the fire, but we could see that blaze, and oil well makes a terrible fire. And they said that they could read newspapers out in their backyard.
How long did that burn?
Gosh, I don't know. I have no idea. Burned too long, I know that.
How did the Depression affect you and your family?
Well, we were in the printing business at that time. Business wasn't too good, but you know, we survived that Depression without any problem. We had to do without a lot of things that we couldn't afford to buy, but it really wasn't bad because we managed by being in the printing business. We managed to make it. Now my daughter-in-law, she won't eat turnips to this day because they had to live on turnips during the Depression. Her daddy was a railroad man, and of course all railroads stopped. They just did away with them practically, and her daddy didn't have a job, and they lived in her grandmother's basement. And she said all they had to eat was turnips, and she will look at a turnip this day.
Were there many soup lines in Oklahoma City?
Yes, St. Anthony's Hospital. They were the main ones that were feeding people, and there were lines and lines and lines of hungry people. You see, they had what they called a Provident Association. Now that Provident Association, they didn't have welfare. And that Provident Association was mostly for schools. It helped school children. And everybody that wanted to, that could do it, that had their children had outgrown clothes, they would take them to the Provident Association, which was at the old Riverside Schoolhouse. And if they needed a button or they needed a little hem changed or something like that done, then the people that could not send their children to school because they had nothing to wear, they could go to Provident Association and be fitted so the children could go to school. And those of us that could, I went a number of times, we'd go over there and help repair those clothes. And but the soup lines, it was really, it was pitiful. They were lined up over there all the time at St. Anthony. St. Anthony seemed to be the main one that was doing it. Of course, they didn't have any government help of any kind then. But I believe it was really better not to have the government take over, and this welfare, I think, has gone beyond help.
Why do you think that?
Well, people helped each other then. They helped each other. And if one person had something that they didn't especially have to have, they'd give it to somebody that was more in need than they were. And people were kind to each other, and they were helpful to each other.
And you knew more about what their immediate needs were.
Yes, absolutely.
And you knew what you were giving and where it was going.
We knew where it went, and we knew it was needed. And then we had a case down here at Franklin. If you haven't been to Franklin, you haven't lived. That's close to Thunderbird. Reasonably close to Thunderbird Lake. But anyway, that's where we used to go to Sunday school when I was a kid. And it was 3 miles from where we lived. But we had a family doctor that lived in Franklin, and he was our Sunday school superintendent. And a woman that lived there nearby in Franklin, they had been farmers, and they had a big acreage of cotton. And her husband died. Typhoid fever was very prevalent then. And her husband had died from typhoid fever. And our doctor and our Sunday school superintendent, he got up in class one Sunday morning and he said, "Folks, I want a bunch of cotton pickers in the morning." Said, "Betty's cotton is ready to be picked." She had 6 children, a widow with 6 children, small children. Said, "Betty's cotton is ready to be picked, and we got to go help her." And they stripped that cotton patch in nothing flat. That week, Betty's cotton was all ready to go to gin. Now, they don't do those things anymore.
Sad, isn't it?
It is sad.
Some of the necessity is gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
And
the cooperation went with the necessity.
Yeah.
I guess.
So that was just one instance, but it happened all the time. If a neighbor needed help, why, they'd go. And one of our neighbors that had the adjoining other quarter of the school quarter, they were in a flood. The creek had flooded and ruined their crop. Well, next thing, one of the neighbors that was on higher ground, he went around and said, "Well, you know, they've been flooded out and they need some help." And everybody donated what they could to help that family because they'd been flooded out.
Did you tell me one time that some of your people were related to the Pauls, who Paul's Valley is named for?
Yes, he married my husband's father. His first wife was a Paul from Paul's Valley, from that family. His first wife was, and she died. And then he married my husband's mother. She died before my husband was born, you know. That was his first wife. And my husband's mother was his second wife.
Did you ever hear him say anything about early date Paul's Valley?
Yes, he used to tell us some things that happened down there, the roughness of it. And there was one family that had shot his own brother, and such horrible things that you don't want to remember.
Well, there was a little place called Seven Shooter out there, and it was on one of those trails, the carriage trails. What were they? And it was a wild place.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it got its name, because there were some tough characters out there.
Yeah. Well, down at Price's Falls, there's a kind of a cave thing in a mountain down there, you know, and they said it was a hideout for some of the Daltons and some of those train robbers, that they used to hide out there in the mountains. That would be a good hiding place down there at Price's Falls.
What do you think has helped you to get to your mature age with the attitude that you have toward living and people?
Well, the nurses at the hospital asked me one time, said, what do you attribute your living as long as you have? My son spoke up. He said, clean living. So I don't know, nothing special. We just, I don't know, my parents were more ambitious than a lot of other people. Some of those people that came from Arkansas, they hadn't had much training, I don't think, or much management or something. I don't know. They were always in debt to the country store. And I don't know, they just, people in the North were so much further advanced. And I don't know, our attitude was different than some of those people that we met after we came to Oklahoma. It seemed like because the North won the war, so they were always ahead of us, see.
Yes, and manufacturing and
everything.
and such as that.
Yeah, education-wise and everything.
Did
else.
you go to church all of your life?
Yes. I started life when I was a little girl at a Lutheran Sunday school, and it is not very far, not much different from the Presbyterian.
I didn't understand the name.
Lutheran Church. Yes, we were always in church. And those years, which they shouldn't have done away with, I don't think, we always had a Christmas tree in the church, and the children always received a sack of candy and nuts and an apple or an orange or something like that. And now they just have a decorated tree, and it don't mean anything else. They said that it was their idea. The churches was the ones that stopped it themselves. They stopped it. But other children that weren't in church and Sunday school all the time, you know, they would come on Christmas Eve, and maybe they wouldn't have even had that much at home, because some of those people were very poor, and they had just real poor farms. They wouldn't grow things like a bottomland would. And it was a lot of fun on Christmas Eve to go to the Christmas tree. And some people would even take their children's gifts and let them get that. The thing that really amazed us, there's so many ways that you can make do. The first Christmas tree that we went to at our schoolhouse, when the first Christmas we spent in Oklahoma, our Christmas tree was in the schoolhouse, and the men had gone out to the blackjacks and cut down a blackjack tree that had a lot of limbs on it, and some of those little old sticky limbs that the blackjacks have, you know, they trimmed it all up nice. And you know what? Those women, they got some green tissue paper, that crepe, not tissue, but crepe paper, and they wrapped every limb on that Christmas tree with that green paper. And we had real candles, little candles about like that, real candles on there. And that was the prettiest thing. And they didn't have any money. There weren't any evergreen trees grew around there. They didn't have any money to go buy one. And I know Norman wouldn't have even had a Christmas tree market at that time. And that was a beautiful tree, all lighted up like that, and tinsel on it, popcorn on it, cranberries strung. They'd work for days to get that Christmas tree stuff ready. But it was really pretty. It was attractive.
This was at church.
No, in the schoolhouse.
In the schoolhouse.
In the schoolhouse.
And did they have a program? And
Yes,
everybody take
yeah.
part?
Every little girl had a little speech to make. It was a lot of fun. It was really a big event.
That was a social event.
Yes, it was. Neighbors would all be there, and you'd have a big time Christmas Eve. But you know, that ended up into something really tragic at Hobart. Do you remember that?
The fire.
That fire at Hobart. Oh, I'll tell you. And you know that there were some people, when that Christmas tree got on fire, those real old candles, you know, they were really dangerous to have on trees. That's what did away with them, that fire at Hobart. And
That's the one that Bab Switch.
at Bab's Switch. Uh-huh. That was terrible. So many people, you see, the doors opened out. They jammed up against the doors, and the doors, of course, wouldn't open. There were too many people behind them. And so many people were burned to death. And there was a couple drove by. We found out years later. A couple drove by and saw that. And there was a little girl that had got out some way. Few people did through the windows. And there was a little girl there, just a little tot, out in the yard, and they picked her up and drove on. Well, you remember that for years and years and years, there was that little girl nobody knew. Some of her family, her mother and dad perished, but some of the family missed her, and they just thought she must have been in the fire. She must have burned, but they never found any trace of a body or anything, and there was years. In fact, it's not been too many years ago since they finally found out what happened to that little girl. This couple picked her up, and they kept her. And she showed up in California, where she had been living with the people that picked her up. And some way she had found out what had happened and how she came there. I think after she got grown, her family told her. But anyway, less than 3 or 4 years ago, there was I was in Texas for Christmas that years after my husband had passed away. And there was a big article came out in their paper reviewing all this and told about this lady that had come from California and was back in her own neighborhood there and had showed up. And then they found out that this couple had picked her up when the schoolhouse was burning.
So the nicest memories you have, what are your nicest memories?
Well,
The ones that give you the most pleasure.
I don't know. I've had a good life. I really have. I've had a good life, and I haven't had anything that was really tragic or bad. And I have had a good life. I had a good married life, and enjoyed our children. And later in years, we got to travel a lot, and I've enjoyed all of it. I've just enjoyed living.
That may be the bottom line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you tell me what food you prepared in the Depression?
Well, you see, the folks were still on the farm, and they were still active on the farm during the Depression, and we would go out there, and Mother always had a good garden, and we lived about like we usually did, because the parents were a big help to us. They had a big garden, and Mother always had a fryer or two to send home with us, and that was one of the nice things that happened to us, that the Depression didn't hurt too bad. There was things we had to do without, but really we didn't mind, and I was so worried about my husband having to go that I didn't mind doing without what we had to do without, what we couldn't buy. So I don't feel bad about the Depression. I don't have the feeling about it that my daughter-in-law has. She has really unhappy memories from it, but I don't know, it was just something we took in our stride. We knew it was going to get better. We were making payments on our home, and it got to where it was hard to get a hold of enough cash to keep the payments out. And then the government did come to our aid. They started what they called the HOLC, homeowners loan. They refinanced everyone's home that was behind on their payments. For a while, the loan companies, we just had to pay interest instead of the regular payment. We just had to pay interest. And then this homeowners loan organized by the government, and they came and refinanced people's homes to where their payments were lower. So there was a lot of people that through that got to hold on to their homes. Some people just threw them up and run, you know, but if you stayed in there, why, you could make it.
You came through.
Uh-huh.
Well,
I think we thank you very much for that. I think it would certainly be worthwhile to listen for, as my father quoted to me, for edification from the Bible.
Yeah.
It certainly is for our edification. Makes us understand more of the kind of people that built our state and the kind of people that it takes to survive.
You must have the Historical Society full of people that were born here that really did go through the real early hardships.
yes, ma'am. Yeah. Oh, also, I was going to ask if you recall the Depression of 1907. Same year that we became a state, there was also a depression.
1907, well, wasn't that the year of the Depression?
No, that was the first depression.
Yeah.
And then the Great Depression was in the 30s.
Oh, where people jumped out of the windows and
Yeah.
all that.
Right.
Yes, I remember it, but we weren't involved. It didn't help and it didn't hinder.
You were at Norman in 1907.
No, we came here in 1903.
But you were still living at Norman then.
Well, 1907,
Yes, ma'am.
that was the year of statehood. We were out in the cotton patch.
Well, his question was, do you remember a depression period at that time?
No, I don't.
Well, it didn't affect the farmers that much, though.
No, I'm
Mainly the
sure it
folks in the
didn't.
city. Yeah.
No, oh, I remember it. People jumping out of windows that had lost their millions and committing suicide. That was pretty horrible for that to have to happen.
That was
But
in 29.
personally, it didn't affect us, and I didn't know any people that were close to us that we really knew, you know, friends or anything like that were involved in that. But that was pretty awful. I think people are getting pretty worried about this deal now.
Well, Ms. Cohee, I want to thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
We enjoyed it. I enjoyed it.
Well, I'm glad you did.
We will, he might explain to you about the tape. Will a tape be available?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Very good.
And when people come in and do research, well, like Statehood Day, they'll listen to your story about Statehood Day. They'll listen to all the different stories and do their research.
It's valuable for research, what
Yeah.
you have told firsthand.
Mhm.
It's not like getting it third hand from somebody that's edited it.
Yeah. Mhm.
What is your name again?
Ina Farrell.
Ina Farrell. I-N-A?
I-N-A.
F-A-R-R.
You didn't have a very comfortable seat.
I-L.
You didn't have a very comfortable seat down there.
I had to get, my hearing's not what it should be. I had to get where I could hear you.
Well,
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be undignified, but I did want to hear.